Grade reports for last quarter were mailed out a week ago. You should have received yours by now.
Today, we'll be talking about the city of Washington, D.C.
D.C.
First of all, let me give you a little background about its name. The original name of the city was Washington City. It was, of course, named after the first president of the United States, George Washington. In later years, the name was changed to the District of Columbia, and I'm sure you can all guess who Columbia was named after. Today, it's most commonly called Washington, D.C., where D.C. is the abbreviated form of District of Columbia. Now, before we go on, let me ask you a question. Can I see from a show of hands how many of you have ever been to Washington, D.C.? About half of you. Well, the half of you who've been there may have a bit to contribute to this discussion based on your experience there. There are 2 points that I'd like to make about Washington, D.C. First of all, this city is unusual in the United States because it's the only U.S. city that is not part of any state. Second of all, this city was the only U.S. city which, for quite some time, was not self-governing. Now, let's look at a map of Washington, D.C. as we discuss the first point. In the early years of the country, the Founding Fathers believed that the capital of the United States should not be part of any state. When a location was chosen for the capital city, 2 states, Maryland and Virginia, were asked to give up land for a capital city. You can see on the map that the District of Columbia was originally a square, with the Potomac River cutting through the square. The area to the northeast of the Potomac originally belonged to the state of Maryland, and the area to the southwest of the Potomac originally belonged to the state of Virginia. In the middle of the 19th century, the portion of the square that had previously belonged to Virginia, the portion to the southwest of the Potomac, was returned to the state of Virginia. Today, the District of Columbia is no longer a square. Instead, the District of Columbia is the portion of the square to the northeast of the Potomac. The second unusual point that I'd like to make about Washington, D.C. is that, for most of its history, it was not a self-governing city. When the city was established, it was decided that its government would be appointed by the President of the United States. The citizens of Washington, D.C. would not elect their own city government. In addition, the citizens of Washington, D.C. for quite some time had no representation in Congress, and they were ineligible to vote for the President of the United States. The citizens of Washington, D.C. were given the right to vote for their government only relatively recently. Citizens of Washington, D.C. were first eligible to vote for the President of the United States in the 1964 election. They didn't have a representative in Congress until 1970, and they didn't elect their own city officials until 1974. Please read the chapter on Washington, D.C. in your textbook and answer the questions at the end of the chapter before next class. I'll see you then.
Something I'm sure you all understand clearly is that the letter C in today's English has 2 very different pronunciations. It can be pronounced like a K, as in the words car, can, or coal. It can also be pronounced like an S, as in the words cent, circle, or seat. What is maybe not so clear is why the letter C has 2 different pronunciations. So let's look at the history and development of the letter C to understand how these 2 very different pronunciations for one letter came to be. Precursors of the letter C existed as the 3rd letter of a number of early alphabets. Look at the letters from these early alphabets, from early Semitic, from Phoenician, and from early Greek. These letters were the predecessors of the letter C. They were each the third letter in their respective alphabets, and they were all formed with a shorter and a longer line meeting at a sharp angle. Now, in each of these languages, the letter was pronounced with a hard G sound, as in go or get. This letter did not have an S or K sound. As languages developed, this early C was used for both the G sound, as in go and get, and the K sound, as in kite or kid. The angular letter seen here from early Latin had two sounds, a K sound and a G sound. By the classical Latin period, these two sounds were differentiated. The early Latin angular letter was rounded to create the letter C of today. This letter was pronounced with a K sound. A new letter was created by adding a line to the C. This new letter had a G sound. Thus, in classical Latin, the letter C was pronounced only with a K sound. Okay, the final change was the addition of the S sound to the letter C. This happened because of the French influence on English. You see, there was a major influence of French on the English language with the victory of the Normans over the Saxons in Britain in 1066. Now, because of this French influence, the letter C took on the S sound in addition to the K sound that it already had. Let's look at this chart of the pronunciation of the letter C. At this point in the English language, the letter C has a K sound when it precedes the vowels A, O, U, or a consonant such as L. The letter C generally has an S sound in front of the vowels E, I, and Y. Okay, now, it's important to make sure that all the pieces of the puzzle are in the right place. There were four stages in the development of the pronunciation of the third letter of the alphabet. In the beginning, the third letter of the alphabet was pronounced with a G sound. Then, in early Latin, the third letter had two sounds, G and K. In later Latin, a new letter was created for the G sound, and the letter C had only a K sound. Finally, because of the French influence on English, the letter C also took on an S sound.